So we're thrilled to have Dr. Margaret here to share some of her wisdom. And I'm also here, I'll introduce myself, Cindy Metzler. I am founder of the Sisterhood for Success, and these two amazing ladies that I'm with tonight are also part of our network and our community. So I have with us Joy McAdams and Tricia Frigo, and two of my dearest friends, and I'm so blessed to have them here. And I'm going to hand over the mic to Joy and then Tricia, and then we'll get right to business with Margaret. So thank you everyone for coming, and Joy, you can take it from here.
And truly, thank you everybody for being here tonight. I think earlier in the summer, we had a call with Margaret, and it was just so eye-opening for myself. And it had me going back and reliving different moments in my life where, this perfectionism was a problem. And I was able to kind of associate, from wanting all the kids to be perfect and my family to look perfect. And it all fell apart. And now it makes sense why I was truly masking deeper issues, and hiding behind this perfectionism. So it really made me start to dig deep and become self-aware. And I know Tricia has an even more personal, powerful story of, finding the book. So Tricia, I'll let you, tell your story.
Thanks, Joy. The reason for the workshop was created after a dear friend of mine took her own life. And we found this book. This book was found on her night table. And once I knew that it was something that she was reading at the time of her death, prior to her death, I decided to purchase it for myself to read it. I was really curious because Patricia was a beautiful, loving, generous, kind woman. She left behind 3 beautiful daughters and a wonderful husband. And it was really, suicide is always a shock, but especially with someone like her. She appeared to have it all to people who knew her and people who just were her acquaintances of hers. So it was especially shocking to find out about her death, and horrifying. It's something that continues to haunt me to this day. So in being able to learn about this concept that Dr. Rutherford has brought to light, this book has been life-changing for me. I don't suffer with the depression side of perfectionism, but this book is really from Patricia, a gift for me to highlight a lot of challenges and issues that I've struggled with in my life. Once I brought this book and the concept to Cindy, who also knew Patricia. Cindy reached out to Dr. Rutherford on LinkedIn and told her a little bit of our story. And she's been so gracious and was so sad to hear about Patricia's story that we just knew that we had to do something to bring this issue to light. Dr. Rutherford highlights a part of depression that very few people really know or understand, and how perfectionism kind of affects depression and masks it. So Dr. Rutherford, we've gotten to know her very well. She's beautiful, lovely spirit. We adore her and are just so grateful for all she's doing to shed a light on this very, very, very important topic. So Cindy, back to you.
Thank you, Tricia. That, again, it's such a personal story for us. And we want to share this meaningful message with everyone, as many people as we can, because we really believe that so many people struggle. And as Tricia said, not everyone struggles with depression, but I do feel like so many parts of the book I read, and so many people that I've spoken to who have read it, felt like Margaret was speaking to them, or giving examples of people that have had experiences that you could completely relate to. And I think everyone can benefit from the book and her wisdom. Couple things. It is a part 1 of a part 2 series. I know Margaret will talk about this. The next one is going to be on August 13th. So I hope that everyone can make it. I did mute everyone, so I would just ask everyone to continue to stay muted so that Margaret can be the center of attention, which we want to be able to listen to her and be respectful of her time, and everyone else's as well. So I'm going to, without further ado, hand it over to Dr. Margaret Rutherford. And again, thank you so much all for being here. And thank you, Dr. Margaret, for sharing your wisdom with us.
Well, gosh, I'm so honored to be here. And Cindy and Tricia and Joy have worked so hard to organize this and to market this. And I'm just joining you here from Arkansas, and I'm delighted to be here. You know, when I heard Pat's story, it took me aback, and I couldn't catch my breath. I think my heart stopped for a second and my eyes filled with tears. And I was so sad for this person that obviously I didn't know. And yet, because of what I've been researching for the last 6 years, I felt as if I knew at least parts of her very well. So what I did was I tried to use that experience and in Pat's death to remind me and to fuel my passion for getting this message out. And I thank all of you for being here. You know, what you can expect today is we're going to cover 6 topics, and there's a lot of information. And so hang on, I'm going to hang on, and I have to talk a little faster than I normally do because I'm from the South and I kind of drawl, but I'll do my best to talk a little faster. We're going to talk about the difference between constructive and destructive perfectionism, because perfectionism in and of itself is obviously not a problem. We're going to talk about the pandemic and how it's affected perfectionists. And I'm going to read some things from a notable researcher on the topic. Then we're going to talk a little bit about the syndrome of perfectly hidden depression, which is my offering to people. We're going to talk about the traits. We're going to talk a little bit about the questionnaire that was in your workshop materials. If you have not gotten that, the workshop materials are at drmargaretrutherford.com/workshop, and they're free to you. We're going to talk about the difference between classic depression and perfectly hidden depression and why that's so important to understand. Then the last thing we're going to talk about is how you got there. You know, there's several workbook type books out there on perfectionism, how to be perfectly imperfect, that kind of thing. And they're good workbooks. There's absolutely nothing wrong with them. But what they miss is they don't talk about the why you're perfectionistic. And it's, if you think about, you know, cutting a weed out of the ground, the weed is going to grow back. You have to get the weed out by its roots. And so that's what my book and my offering is all about to you. There's an important point to talk about, however. Of course, many of you are here. I don't know why you're here. I don't know, and you don't have to tell us. I don't know if you're here because you're perfectionistic yourself, or you have cared and loved someone who really struggled with perfectionism and vulnerability. Whether you're just curious, whether you're in therapy, whether you're not in therapy, but there are some of you probably who are here that this is going to stir up some things for you. And so I want you to be very careful, because if it does, we don't want your struggles to be so powerful for you that, you know, we can talk about the hole that's coming up in the road and we want to avoid. I just don't want you to fall in the hole. Okay. So this is what I want you to do and what I'm offering you. My email is askdrmargaret at drmargaretrutherford.com. It is confidential. If you need a consultation with me, not a therapy session, I can't do a therapy session with you, but I certainly can consult with you and say, this is, if this is stirring you up, this is the next step you need to have. So I really want you to pay attention, and please be careful and kind with yourself.
Margaret, just before you start, I'm going to mute everyone and then unmute you, because I hear a little bit in the background and I just want to make sure that everyone is muted. Okay.
Great. Okay. Okay. Hopefully you can hear me now, right?
Can everyone hear Margaret?
Okay. Let's talk about this distinction between constructive perfectionism and destructive perfectionism. Really, striving for excellence is something that very productive, creative, energetic people who have determination and stubbornness and all kinds of things. That's a good thing to have. There's nothing wrong with striving for excellence. The issue becomes, when it is fueled by shame. Now, let's talk a little bit about the difference between shame and guilt. Guilt is remorse for something that you've said or done, a mistake you've made, sticking your foot in your mouth, and you feel remorse. You have to apologize, and it's something that you claim, okay, I did this. This was a mistake. That's guilt. Shame is when you make that mistake and you say, I'm a terrible person because I made that mistake. Okay. And actually, the presence of the presence of guilt is actually a contraindicator for destructive perfectionism, meaning that if you tend to feel guilty about things, you're probably much more likely a constructive perfectionist. It's more, it has to do with your ideals, your passions, your values. You can usually say no, but it's a process oriented kind of perfectionism, meaning you're really enjoying how you're getting there. And rather than it being goal oriented, you are more process oriented. A metaphor might be, for example, for a swimmer, and the swimmer who wants to do very well is much more aligned with how they're swimming, whether they're going to beat their own personal best. They're not constantly looking in the other lanes to see if they're going to win. They're not looking up to see if their coach is giving them a high five. They're just swimming because they enjoy swimming. That's what striving for excellence is like. And that's what constructive perfectionism is like. But let's talk about destructive perfectionism. It's fueled by shame, and you've got to do better than you did last time. If you can think of shame as these little gnomes, these mischievous, ugly gnomes that are whispering in your ear all the time. And they're telling you, you can't do this. I don't know why you were selected for this. You'll fail. You never do this kind of thing well. It's shame after shame after shame. And so, in order to quiet those voices or try to, you become very goal oriented. You become very set to accomplish whatever it is that's going to prove to you one more time that you really are okay, that you are worthy and you have value. The problem is with destructive perfectionism that that voice never shuts up. And so you've got to keep on doing and keep on doing. And I'll have some examples of that in real life cases later on in the presentation. It has more to do with meeting the expectations of others. There's a thing in the research called socially prescribed perfectionism that's all about you get caught up and pressured to constantly feel that you know the expectations of others and that you can meet them. You don't say no. You have if you say no, it's highly unusual. You're always saying yes and yes and yes and yes. And so more and more piles on your plate. And you can't accept mistakes and failures. So you don't guilt yourself. You don't feel guilty about things. You feel shame. It's a very goal oriented approach. You are always looking at other people in the lane when you're swimming and checking to see if your coach is pleased. That's constantly what destructive perfectionists do. The issue is, and Brene Brown, who has written about this eloquently and has researched it, if you don't know her work, go look her up. She is phenomenal. She would say the problem is you can't control what others believe about you. You're going to attend this workshop today. I'm doing the best I know to do and the best I can. I have no control over whether you look at yourself in the mirror and go, well, that was a waste of time, or whether you say, I'm really glad I attended. I'm looking forward to this part two. I have no control over that. I might remind you of the sister-in-law you hated from your ex-husband, or I might look like, somebody from your past that, some teacher that really treated you badly. I have no idea. I have no control over that. So what you think about me is really up to you. And the problem is that destructive perfectionists think they can control that, and they can't. So you're probably somewhere, most of us are probably somewhere on the spectrum between I keep wanting to say conservative, um, constructive perfectionists and destructive perfectionists. Most of us are in the middle. And that's why I came up with that questionnaire. I was trying to it's not clinically researched, it's not empirically researched. I was trying to come up with a way for people to be able to quantify themselves on a spectrum. Okay, what kind of perfectionist am I? And if you could take the questionnaire, which we suggested you do before this conference, then you might have said, gosh, I just have a few of these traits, or yeah, I'm smack dab in the middle, or whoa, I scored really high. Now, we'll talk more about what that score means probably during the question and answer period. But again, perfectionism, like everything else, is on a spectrum, okay? But if you took it, I hope it sheds some light on where you might stand. And the happy news is that many of you are probably in the lower range, but some of you are going to be over the top. And so this is for you. Now, I will tell you, years ago, I was at some conference and I was in my motel room and I heard about the Enneagram and I thought, oh, okay, well, I'll take it. And I took it and I hated my score. I mean, I hated the number I was. I was like, oh, no, I don't want to be like that. So I completely discounted the Enneagram because I said, that's not me. So, you may have taken my questionnaire and gone, no, that's not me. And, that's fine. But I do think that it's important to understand sort of where you are. And we're going to talk about more of the traits that the actual questionnaire is based on. So maybe you'll even get more clear during this workshop. Let's talk about the pandemic. This workshop is entitled Perfectionism Meets Pandemic. And gosh, I cannot really think of another societal or cultural or medical or spiritual or emotional thing that could have happened that would have tested perfectionists more than this has. And I'll be very specific. There's a wonderful researcher named Dr. Gordon Flett, F-L-E-T-T. He's Canadian. And he was wonderful to me when I was writing the book and spent hours with me talking about his research and really educated me about some of the more recent research on perfectionism. And he was interviewed by I think it was The Atlantic, and they said, and this is what he told them about the pandemic and perfectionism. I'm quoting. In overwhelming situations that evoke feelings of helplessness, medical personnel are going to be prime candidates for post-traumatic stress. But this will be also especially true for driven perfectionists who are troubled by their lack of control. These remarkable people will, in all likelihood, keep pushing themselves beyond the point of exhaustion. They're driven by the pressure they feel to live up to the exceedingly high expectations imposed on them by other people and society in general. He's very worried about how perfectionists are going to come out of all of this. You've got to remember that, think about that swimming metaphor again. They count on external feedback to help them feel valuable, right? You don't have the external feedback anymore. You are teacher, you are cook, bottle washer, you're no longer going into work. You're dealing with so much more ambiguity. How do you define success during a pandemic? So this need for this kind of feedback and this sense of achievement is gone. A lot of it, it's gone. So I think these people are really lost. And on the positive side, these are very uh, honorable people. They're determined people. But on the problematic side, it can be very lonely and very, very despairing. I'll give you an example of someone I've been working with, and this was in a telehealth session fairly recently. She definitely identifies with destructive perfectionism or perfectly hidden depression. And in an article in Psychology Today, this is how I described it to people. After the first few minutes of the session were spent rapidly explaining the vast needs of others she serves and her duty to meet those needs, she began acting in the session as if it were her job to take care of me, asking about whether or not I had certain things in order. I think she was talking about PPE and that kind of thing. So I stopped her and I thought, what's she doing? I asked her to pause and breathe and tell me what she actually felt in that moment. And this is very hard for these folks. We'll talk about more of that later. She kind of gazed out the window with a very flat expression on her face and said, I'm soul tired. S-O-U-L. I'm soul tired. And almost immediately, she snapped out of that, smiled very brightly, detached from her poignant admission, and said, but I'll catch up on my sleep. Now's not the time for sleep. So there's this awareness of this being soul tired underneath this taking care of other people and making sure their needs are met and my needs were met and making sure that that's what she's doing in her world. And that is a problem. I'll tell you a little bit about the story of the book because we're going to talk about the core traits of perfectly hidden depression. You're probably wondering, where in the world did I come up with that term, right? Well, it was in April of 2014, and I was writing a weekly blog post by that time. And I decided to write about some of these people that I had seen over the years that when they walked in my door, they would have never have admitted that they were depressed. They didn't look depressed. They didn't seem depressed. So how did I know there was something wrong? Basically, I knew because they could not talk about anything painful in their lives. They would look at me and say, I'm just not a crier, or if I started crying, I'd never stop, or I would ask them about their childhoods and they would tell me about something really very traumatic. And they'd sort of have a smile on their face and go, well, that happened a long time ago. And so many people have it worse than me. This constituted for me a big problem, because literally for some of these people, I remember a woman very well who was talking about being raped before college, and violently. And if I had turned the sound down of the session, if I could possibly do that, I wouldn't have been able to tell that she was talking about being raped. I would have thought she was talking about what she ordered for lunch. So there was this huge disconnect between the facts of her life and what had really happened to her, and how she was allowing herself to connect with it. And she wasn't allowing herself to emotionally connect with it at all. So I wrote about these people, and I just grabbed the term perfectly hidden depression. It seemed to fit to me out of the air. The blog post was called "A Perfectly Hidden Depressed Person, Are You One?" And it went viral. And then when I put it on the Huffington Post, I was being published there at the time, I got hundreds of emails over the next 24 hours. Hundreds. This is me. I've never heard about this. How did you get in my head? I answered all those emails, by the way. So then what I started doing was writing about, trying to figure out in my own mind, formulating the questionnaire, what is it about these people? How could they be alike? And what I was greatly aided by were these interviewees who volunteered to tell me their stories. And I talked to about 60 of them, about hour and a half to 2 hour interviews anonymously. Some of them let me know who they were, but most of them used not their real names. And so I spent lots of time listening to these stories and gathering their stories. And that's when I started thinking, what do these people share in common? All of these, in fact, I took the stories and began just kind of, again, not in a scientific method, I'm a clinician, but just said, okay, this one was this and this one was this. And okay, so 10 of those there. And I began thinking, all right, what is most shared in these people? And I came up with 10 core traits that, again, the questions in the questionnaire definitely reflect. And if you've taken the questionnaire, you will find yourself in it. Okay, so these are the 10 core traits. We'll go through them fairly quickly. Number 1 is you're highly perfectionistic with a constant critical inner voice of intense shame. We've basically already covered that. So you're the perfect parent, the most accomplished lawyer, you're head of the class, you're the best friend, and you may not even see yourself as a perfectionist, again, because you don't believe that anything you do is perfect enough, because that inner shame is constantly in your ear. Number 2, now a lot of these are interrelated, okay? You demonstrate a heightened or excessive sense of responsibility. You have duties important to you, obligation, loyalty. You can be counted on in a crunch. You obviously always figure out the right thing to do at the right time. And so you can really be counted on. Number 3, you have difficulty accepting and expressing painful emotions, like we were talking about. Sadness is banished to the back of the closet. Disappointment is for whiners. You may not even have words to express these emotions. I've literally handed someone a child's list of emotions that you could give to a child, and they said, "Oh, okay, I think I'm disappointed. Oh, okay, I think I'm this." There's just no language for it often. Number 4, you worry a great deal and avoid situations where control isn't possible. The need for control is really strong, and this is kind of a cycle, because you worry about something. Let's say your parents need more care at home. So what do? The responsible part of you says, well, I'll control this. I'll know I do it well. So you take on the responsibility. But then you feel more out of control, which makes you worry more, which makes you take more responsibility, which makes you worry more. And so it's this cycle that's just unending. Okay, so these people also stay very overly analytical. They just don't do the emotions very well. Number 5, you intensely focus on tasks, using accomplishment as a way to feel valuable. A motto here is you're only as good as your last success. You count on activity. That's why the pandemic is so hard. You count on activity and accomplishment to distract yourself from any inner insecurities. But you carry it too far. There's value and purpose and effort, but you go way beyond the pan. No, that's not the phrase. Anyway, you do too much of it. You have an active and sincere concern about the well-being of others while allowing few, if any, into your inner world. One of the things I played around with this idea, I said, do these people really care about their friends? Or is this sort of a distraction? Are their friendships a distraction? And what I learned as I processed and listened to the stories is no, these people actually have a lot of empathy for what can go wrong. We're going to talk about childhood in a minute, but they come from childhoods where they weren't given a lot of empathy. And so they have learned to be very empathic with other people and care deeply about what's going on in other people's lives and in people's lives that they love. They just don't know how to open up themselves. They have no way. Vulnerability scares the daylights out of them. So they don't know how to talk about feeling overwhelmed or lonely or fatigued. And in fact, sometimes when they do risk trying to tell somebody, guess what they get in return? What? You're depressed? No, I've never seen anybody have a better looking life than yours. Your life's perfect. So even if they do reach out, they kind of get shamed for it, or that's what they do with it. They say, oh my gosh, I considered for a second that something might be wrong. And look at all my blessings. And they just feel ashamed. Here's that voice. And they go back into hiding. Number 7 is you discount or dismiss hurt or abuse from the past or the present. Compartmentalization is a fancy psychological word for basically putting things that you're not ready to deal with yet on the back burner. Okay. So compartmentalization is good. If my dog had died, which he did not this morning, but if he had, and I had this presentation to do, I would have to compartmentalize my grief. That's a healthy skill. The problem with people with destructive perfectionism or perfectly hidden depression is that they rigidly over compartmentalize. John Kabat-Zinn, who's a leader in mindfulness, talks about it with rigid positivity. So they developed very strong boxes to put things in. And I had a woman tell me one time, if I don't have a box that's big enough for that pain, I'll just build a bigger box. So they push it away, push it away, push it away until, frankly, sometimes they can even forget it's there. It almost becomes unconscious. They don't even think about it anymore, like the rape. Like the woman said, I've just really, I don't think that was a big deal. It's become an unconscious thing. Now, number 8, I actually added because I'm a clinician, and I didn't want anybody to think that some problem they were having that actually could be diagnosed clinically was, oh, that's just perfectly hidden depression. Because these folks often have accompanying health issues that are actual mental health diagnoses, like an eating disorder, like an anxiety disorder. They usually involve control or the need to escape. They might have a benzodiazepine problem, like a Xanax or a Ativan problem. And so they're usually either these problems can be about control or trying to get control by escape. And often you have to work on that problem before you're ready to actually work on the perfectionism. Number 9 is you hold a strong belief in counting your blessings as the foundation of well-being. Now, counting your blessings, you bet. But the glass is half full and half empty by definition. And every blessing has what I call an underbelly. I mean, I loved writing this book. It was published. I couldn't believe it. But I had to work really hard. I don't know anything about writing a book. And so sometimes I would complain about how tiring it was and how I didn't know what I was doing and I didn't know where I was going. It was confusing. And my private practice doctor said, you've gotten every sickness you can get. So I'll be glad when this book is done. So, that was the underbelly of my joy and my sense of fulfillment about writing the book, because it came along with its own set of issues. And this is a problem, especially for people of faith, because they will say to themselves, I'm not strong enough in my faith, or I'd only be counting my blessings. Huge problem. So I think that this is a really strong diagnostic criteria. Number 10, you have emotional difficulty in personal relationships, but demonstrate significant professional success. What that means is we worship perfectionism in the workplace. We want that person who I want my brain surgeon to be perfectionistic. I want my accountant to be perfectionistic. And the person who gets the job done better and faster than everybody else, yeah, we want them on our team. So perfectionism is definitely something that's rewarded in many, many workplaces. So you're going to be professionally successful, but your ability to have emotional intimacy is really limited. Sometimes that's also made more complicated by the fact that you're attracted to people who really want an over responsible, over functioning person in their lives. Narcissists, under functioners want someone who's going to take the responsibility, work really, really hard in the relationship. They're gonna be attracted to you and you to them sometimes. You also may attract someone who also wants a perfect looking life and is sort of settled to have kind of a superficial life, also who's invested in it looking perfect. So that can be a problem in your relationships. However, I also will say that I've gotten lots of emails from people who are partnered with people who identify with, well, they don't identify with it yet, but their partner identifies them with perfectly hidden depression and say, how do I approach them? Because her best friend moved away or her mother was diagnosed with cancer and I haven't seen her. It's just like she just went to work and that's all she's doing is just working her way through this. Or he hasn't even mentioned that his mother has cancer and how do I approach him? So it's not always, but emotional intimacy is scary for you obviously because it's about vulnerability. Tricia asked me a really good question when we were first getting to know each other. She said, but is this really depression? It doesn't seem like, is it just destructive perfectionism? And, a perfectionist would say to me also, and isn't everybody like this? Isn't everybody counting their blessings and, being responsible and being loyal and having a sense of duty? No, everybody's not like that. The reason why it's so important to see it as a different kind of depression is this, because it's hard to see. Because these people, I don't know if Patricia reached out for help or not. I only know that my book was on her bedside table. But if she did, sadly, she might be handed a depression inventory and she would score low. She might be, the therapist would look at their diagnostic criteria, which we're going to go over in just a second, for classic depression and say, you're not depressed. I think you're just tired. I think you maybe you worry too much. You need to take a vacation. And these very people, in fact, a lot of the interviewees told me they had tried to seek help. About half of them. They had tried to seek help and they had been turned away. So these folks are going, they're slipping through the cracks of our mental health system. And more of them, according to Dr. Flett and his team of researchers, are getting to a place where taking their own lives are the only option. And that is just unacceptable to me. So I want us to know, what's the difference? What is this presentation of depression like? And how can we catch it? So that's why it's important. Let's talk a bit about how classic, again, lots of information. Hope you're keeping up with me. I'm trying to keep up with myself. How is classic depression different than perfectly hidden depression? And again, remember, perfectly hidden depression, not a diagnosis. Classic depression is a diagnosis where two criteria must be met. You must have depressed mood that is noticeable by yourself or by others and lasts a certain period of time, or you have to have what's called anhedonia. Anhedonia is a fancy word for you just aren't getting the joy out of things that used to bring you joy and fulfillment. If you like to go walking, you don't want to walk. If you liked to paint, you don't paint. So you can either have a depressed mood or you can have anhedonia or you can have both, but you have to have one of those to be diagnosed with moderate depression, severe depression, and obviously people who identify with perfectly hidden depression are not going to have those. Now, there is something called high functioning or smiling depression, but those people know they are depressed. They might be the people who would walk in my office and say, I know I'm depressed, I'm on an antidepressant, I'm in therapy, or I have been in therapy, but I still get up in the morning and slap a smile on my face. So they are dealing with the fact that they know they're depressed. They just have a certain style about them that they might identify with some of perfectly hidden depression. That's true. And certainly people with classic depression are doing a wonderful job, many of them, at getting up in the morning and taking their meds and going to work, despite the fact that they really feel lousy and they don't want to get out of bed. So my hat's off to them. But there is something called high functioning depression. People with classic depression may or may not seek treatment. It's readily diagnosable using standard criteria. They're not likely to score well on depression inventories, meaning they're going to, well, or they're going to score high. They may be suicidal, but they'll often admit they're suicidal. It may be linked to trauma or it may be learned, but there's plenty of self-help books out there for them. So let's contrast that with perfectly hidden depression. Depressed mood or anhedonia is not seen by the self or others. They're very high functioning. They more than likely will not seek treatment, and if they do, it's often for other issues like we've already talked about. It's not readily diagnosable as it doesn't meet criteria. They'll pass depression inventories with flying colors. There's a story in the book about a man who went to a psychiatrist and took his depression inventory and scored, fine on it. 3 weeks later, he tried to kill himself, and the psychiatrist actually came in his room and said, "But I gave you that depression inventory. And you answered all the questions like you weren't depressed." And he looked at him and said, "You didn't ask me the right questions. If you had asked me, you asked me, do you ever feel hopeless?" And I said, "No." If you'd asked me, if you ever did feel helpless, would you tell anyone? My answer would still be no. And you would know something was wrong. They may be suicidal, but they will not admit or reveal. And they're often tied to trauma, which they don't even call trauma. I think it's helpful to think about this in medical symptomatology. Think about the heart attack literature. Think about all the women who suffered through heart attacks because they did not fit classic criteria. They were turned away by their cardiologist because their symptomatology is different than men's. So what they had to do in their research was discover, wait a minute, how does a female typically or commonly express heart disorder symptoms? And actually, I have a quote from a doctor at Johns Hopkins. Women are much more likely to have atypical heart attack symptoms. So while the classical symptoms such as chest pains apply to both men and women, women are much more likely to get less common symptoms such as indigestion, shortness of breath, and back pain. When I read this, it was like, okay, so the cardiologist woke up to the idea that they needed to ask different questions. They weren't asking the right questions. They weren't looking for the right thing. That is what I'm so passionate about, that mothers, parents, teachers, daughters, sons, we all need to understand that there's a kind of depression that looks like someone has a perfect looking life. I have been so heartbroken that parents have talked to me and written to me about their teenage sons and daughters who have taken their own lives, but they looked like they were on the best ride of their life. And yet they were so pressured and hid so much that they killed themselves. I don't want to hear about stories like that. I want us to be aware that there's another kind of depression that has different symptoms, just like female heart attacks. Now, let me also be clear. Perfectionism has been seen as a problem for many years. I'm certainly not narcissistic enough to think, oh, I'm the one that came up with this. Perfectionism has been shown to be a problem. In fact, a guy named Sidney Blatt many years ago also kind of questioned these diagnostic criteria when it came to perfectionism. Let's talk about what actually causes this. Because it is so, again, like the root analogy, we've got to get to the root of this, in my opinion. So rather than, now I'm also going to read you some stories. I want to make sure I have time to do that. We're going to go through several etiologies or ways this can get started. And maybe you'll find yourself in here again. This may be the point at which you get a little stirred up, okay? Maybe all of this has been, okay, I can analyze this, I can hear it. But now we're going to be talking about your childhood. So this may be, so please be safe with yourself. First, the important reasons why the perfect looking life became a working or outwardly successful strategy. Number one, you absorb the shame from physical or sexual abuse. The damage from being the target of sexual manipulation or violence can silence you because you were told to shut up, and keep the secret. You know, that way staying in control has become very vital to you because you were so out of control. You were so unsafe. But also at the same time, you absorbed the shame that didn't belong to you. You told yourself, I could have stopped this. Maybe this was my fault. So you're carrying around an intense need for control while you're also carrying around very silent shame. The second situation is you had to keep yourself safe from a parent's violence or neglect due to substance abuse. How many times have I been told there was always beer in the fridge, but there wasn't food? You learned to be really hypervigilant, or you learned to devote yourself to school so you could get away from home. You became, perhaps another strategy was to become invisible so that you could protect yourself from not being loved well. You just learned to look very cautious as if you were doing fine, but you're always waiting for others to be disappointing to you. Here's the third one. You were emotionally disdained and had to prove your worth no matter the cost. You were screamed at. You weren't going to amount to anything, or that you were too sensitive. You were whining. So you avoid admitting vulnerability like the plague, and you're determined to be on top. You're obsessed with proving the bullies or the parent or the teacher or coach wrong. Okay. Number 4, you never really had a childhood and took a pseudo adult role in your family. It just became your job to take care. Sometimes this is because of an alcoholic parent. Sometimes this is because a parent is working 3 jobs and is never home. Perhaps one of your or both of your parents suffered mental or physical illness and didn't act as a mature adult. So you basically took care of your brothers and sisters. And guess what? You've just become innately responsible. You don't know how to talk about your own struggles. This one's kind of different. You were the star of your family. You were highly praised for your successes. They were expected from you. They were sort of the least you could do. Faltering or making mistakes wasn't about learning. They were seen as failure. You were labeled the smart one, the athletic one, the accomplished one. You don't give us any problems. I love you for that. So you keep now the thumb in your back, thinking the only way I'll ever get anything positive is to remain a superstar. But that means also you can't show any struggle or vulnerability. Let's face it, another reason is still males in our culture are often taught that vulnerability is a big no-no. And so even women can sometimes tell them that. I've had men tell me, yeah, I try to be vulnerable. And women go, I don't want that. I don't want a wuss as a boyfriend. So, it's vulnerability can be very hard for many men. The next one is no one in the family was allowed to express painful emotion of any kind. I mean, it just wasn't done. If you were angry, you went to your room until you weren't angry anymore, when you can act nice. I had this kind of family. Or you weren't allowed to cry. You were told that was baby. You weren't allowed to talk about anything that was painful in the family. I've had people say their mother died and all the pictures of the mother were gone, and the father said, we will not talk about your mother in this house anymore. So you decided maybe you weren't the emotional kind, and you became silent. You stopped asking for comfort because there was none available. After all, what better way to cope than to believe that what's absent isn't even needed? Okay, 2 more. You feel or felt responsible for a parent's happiness or fulfillment. This is enmeshment. Basically, you feel like your job is to please your parent, and your parent can't give you permission to grow up and leave the family and become independent. So you hide everything about yourself that might be displeasing, and you only show what's really successful looking. I did this. I definitely did this for years. I can remember choosing a new outfit every time I would go home, and it would always cost more than I could really afford. And I just wanted my especially my mother to think I was just doing great, and my life was a mess. Okay. This is the last one, and this has really come to my mind, and I wish I had more in the book. I don't have much of anything in the book about race. But basically what this one states is your family culture didn't or doesn't support emotional openness or uniqueness, because there's a vast amount of difference between countries and cultures in how emotions are understood and expressed. So maybe your religious ethnicity, the beliefs and rules and expectations you were taught shaped your comfort or permission to express your confusion and pain. For example, what if your gender identity wasn't supported, your race, your religious preference, or your sexuality? So the only option for you was to begin to try to be perfect. I have several African American patients right now, and what they've told me is that, and they're all perfectionistic and very successful, by the way. and outwardly, externally. And they said to me, especially we've been talking about Black Lives Matter, and I said to them, I'm working with them to help them become less perfectionistic. And one of them very poignantly said to me, Margaret, being perfect was the only way I felt like I would get any success, because I couldn't be just myself and be laid back and mistakes. I had to be perfect or I wouldn't be chosen. And I thought so much about that. And so giving that up for them is like really, really frightening. And I have much more respect for that now than I did when I wrote the book. And if I get to write a second edition, it'll definitely be in it. So if you've had a gender identity or a sexuality issue or race or religious, you changed, you became Hindu after, and you were raised Baptist, you can often be ostracized because of that. And so try to look perfect to make up for it. Okay, all of that sounds depressing. How do I get out of that? Now, that's what part 2 is going to be about. Part 1 has been about what is perfectly hidden depression, what is destructive perfectionism, how is the pandemic affecting it. But the second part 2 will be all about what you can do about it, because I promise you, I'm a very direct and a solution-oriented kind of therapist. So I'm going to read you 3 stories of people that I've worked with that have definitely been on their way to healing. This is Tony. Tony was born into a wealthy Virginian family. He was the quarterback of his football team, homecoming king, basically Mr. High School. His mother pushed him to play violin, which he hated. But like everything he touched, he had to excel, eventually even giving a senior recital. He recalled, she would tell all her friends that I was so good at everything, that I was a great son, and I couldn't take that away from her. In the final seconds of the game for the conference title, he threw what he thought was a well-timed pass. The receiver couldn't get to it. The only thing said by his dad afterward, let's go home. No comfort was offered. Tony lived his adult life completely defined by what he perceived others expected from him. He began to secretly seethe about always having done the right thing. Sadly, he acted out his anger instead of recognizing the prison he'd created for himself, and he began having affairs. Turn the page. After Tony's wife found out, he became actively suicidal and was hospitalized. Then he began outpatient work with me, and the perfectionistic prison in which he lived his life became obvious. In therapy, his sessions couldn't go a minute overtime before he stood up abruptly. At one point, an alternative treatment for anxiety and trauma was discussed. That was EMDR, and he refused, saying to me, listen to this, he didn't know if he would do it correctly. Tony was highly involved with his kids and well-liked for his apparent easygoing style, but he was filled with shame about mistakes he'd made with no way to express that shame. This made me so sad when he said this. One day he confessed, I saw a picture of myself the other day when I was 4. I felt an overwhelming desire for that child to stay a child, where he could always think of himself as successful. I wanted to say to him, buddy, you're going to make such bad mistakes. Just stay 4. Tony began letting go of his intense inner critic. He made connections with what he'd been trying to avoid feeling. He learned that his own being was important. He slowly learned words for feelings, and they were important to voice. And he actually stopped watching the clock, allowing the session to end much more naturally. That's Tony. Now let's talk about Danielle. Danielle had been sexually abused as a toddler by a cousin who still lives in her childhood home with her parents. She confronted her cousin and told her parents and siblings about what had happened. They listened, but nothing changed. Her cousin denied everything. Now, as an adult, Danielle was struggling with perfectly hidden depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and anorexia. Her anorexia had become so severe that I had to hospitalize her before we could continue treatment and normalize her eating before we could continue. She didn't like that and fought the idea, but with the support of her husband, she agreed to go. After she returned, a nutritionist was brought in so her work on her trauma and perfectionism could safely continue. Danielle always had a smile on her face during therapy, no matter the topic, and would catch any tear before it rolled down her cheek. Highly uncomfortable. She would kind of do like this, so she would just dab her eye. Highly uncomfortable that her pain was showing. As therapy became more and more specific about her abuse and her family's avoidance and denial, she would obsessively clean her home to avoid feelings that were growing more insistent. as she and I talked and processed. And she had to very carefully monitor her eating and exercise, a battle that she didn't always win. Her progress was slow, but proceeding safely was paramount. When painful feelings grew more insistent, one day she said, I need to sit with these feelings. I don't want to. I'm afraid of them, but I'm not making good decisions. I don't want to eat. I'm cleaning too much. I work out too hard, even to the point of hurting myself. I feel invisible in my family and even to myself. So she and I sat in silence. She allowed her feelings to surface very slowly, without judgment, without censorship, without shame. She had so much to grieve. Slowly, the tears came. Sobs followed. And I simply moved over to the sofa, asked if it was okay, and I held her. She's never forgotten that session, and it was a huge turning point for her. Last story is about Laura. Laura was a 50-something woman who'd been in an emotionally abusive relationship for years. She'd taken the blame over and over for the conflicts between her and her husband in order to keep the peace. She focused on raising her kids, volunteering for several organizations in the community, and running an interior design firm that is specialized in remodeling. She often did pro bono work for those who couldn't afford her services and was known citywide for her generosity. She'd chosen to challenge her habit of taking on excessive responsibility as the best place for her healing work to begin. She laughed. It may not be much, but I went to my PEO meeting this month. They were asking for volunteers to run the upcoming silent auction, something I've always done, to ask for items and get them all ready. I sat on my hands, literally. She then went on to discuss what had happened when she left the meeting. I got in my car, and all of a sudden, there were tears in my eyes. I was ashamed of myself. I said, other people are as busy as I am. I should have taken my share. Then I stopped myself. Why do I feel like I always have to do more? The answer to that question became clear. Laura was adopted as a child, treasured and pampered by her parents. Yet they would also remind her how lucky she was, that if she hadn't been adopted by them, she wouldn't have all the privileges she enjoyed now. Her worth didn't reside in her. It was dependent on their generosity, or that was perhaps not intentionally, but that message was the one they gave to her as a child. There was no arguing with that logic. Rationally, those facts were true. They'd adopted her, but she thanked her parents over and over for the adoption. It was in that moment that Laura began to recognize her need to invest inexhaustible energy in others was based on the insecurity that she felt as a child. She finally saw that she finally saw that she had nothing to prove. She was deserving of love. Simply sitting on her hands had opened the way to incredible insight and self-compassion. I tell these stories to say healing is very possible. Your goals of self-acceptance, of freedom, of openness, of revealing vulnerability can lead to so much change and so much relief and so much less pressure. You know, I believe that insight can be very, very helpful as a context. It gives you context. It helps you connect the dots between your childhood, your teenage years, and your adulthood. But where you get hope is when you see yourself change, when your thinking changes, when your feelings change, and when your actions change. And I hope you'll come back for part 2. Let's talk about whatever questions you have and comments about part 1. Any questions you have about the workshop materials, and we'll talk for a few minutes. And I'll be glad to stop talking and hear from y'all. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Margaret. That was incredible. Just so moving. And your voice, for anyone, we didn't mention this, but Margaret has an amazing podcast called Self Work. And it's ranked one of the most popular podcasts we've just learned. So yeah, I would encourage everyone to, check out her podcast. And in the meanwhile, before part 2. So I have a question.
Sure.
And then I would encourage anyone to just type in the chat feature any questions, and we can ask Margaret. So I think it's a little bit tricky, but as you were speaking, I was thinking, Now we've discovered or identified some of the traits of people that have perfectly hidden depression. And if there's someone like a loved one or someone we think that might have, that we identify that may have it,
Right.
and their characteristic is not to share, how would you recommend as a therapist that a friend or a loved one or a family member could potentially help them?
I get this question all the time, Cindy, and I really think that it's a lot like trying to approach any problem that someone is in denial about, whether that be an addiction, whether that be, you know, people with perfectly hidden depression. When they're ready to see it, they will see it, but it's hard for them to see because they, again, they'll think I'm not perfectionistic and I'm just doing what I was taught to do as a child. I'm just doing what I think is right, and there's nothing wrong with me. But what the partner can do, or someone who loves them, can say, what I miss in our relationship is that we don't, or I don't ever seem to hear from you the things that trouble you. You're very open to listening to me, but sometimes I want to give you the gift of listening to you. I want to have that kind of give and take. And I miss that in our relationship. Or if you have a child, it seems to be just floating on air all the time and is constantly, doing well. The best thing you can do is model your own vulnerability. Say, a lot of times when I was doing really well, I felt incredible amounts of pressure to keep on doing well. Do you ever feel that way? Where you open the conversation with them. I was lucky enough, I have one son and he and I are very close, and he had something happen to him in college, or he made a bad choice. And I had also made that choice, which I had revealed to him and told him, the kinds of problems that caused me. And when he called me, he said, I called you, Mom, because I know that you've been through this. And that's why I'm talking to you about it, because I know you know how it feels. I nearly jumped up and down in joy. I thought, oh my gosh, thank goodness I talked to him about it. Thank goodness I talked to him about my own struggles. And so, because, we had to help him. I had to help him. And I was delighted to try to do it. I was honored to do it. So basically what you want to do, if you're a parent, you want to be vulnerable with your children. You want to model for them that that's okay. If this is a friend, or if this is a partner, a life partner, then approaching them, talking about yourself, maybe even getting into therapy yourself, saying, you know what, I'm so confused about our relationship that I want to try to go into therapy. Would you come with me? Sometimes if they don't think the focus is on them, they will come. The other thing is to just don't say, you never talk about yourself. Don't use you language, because that makes anybody defensive. All of a sudden we feel like we're on the prosecutor is interviewing us, and they want us to find the problems that we have, and we get defensive. So you just talk about yourself. And then I've had people say, do you think it'd be a good idea to share an article with her? Yes, I do. Or him. I actually think that sometimes just saying, I read this, and I wonder if you might think this applies to you. I'm not sure, but there were some things that caught my attention. Again, you're sort of planting seeds. Now, obviously, if you think you have a partner who is suicidal but is not talking about it, if you find something on the computer or on their phone that alarms you, then you have to be a lot more direct than that. You have to say, I found this and I need to know what's going on. I love you, and let's talk. You can talk to me about anything. I don't care what this is about. And so, that, but often, as I've said, um, these people can expertly mask this. And I know, I gave an example of a woman at the very beginning of the book that, gosh, her husband was worried about her, and I had diagnosed her with anxiety. And I actually, which is very unusual, but I went over to her house and I said, I let myself in per the husband, and she was trying to die by suicide. And she often tells me if I hadn't found her that, that she would be dead now. And I just stood there dumbstruck thinking, oh my gosh, I didn't even think she was depressed. And I'm trained to see this. So so you don't want to beat yourself up and say, well, if they do say, yes, I'm depressed, then, but you want to try to stay open with them and say, you know, maybe I have partnered along with you to just not talk about the hard stuff, but I want to do that now with you. Will you join me, and invite them to join you?
Great, thank you. So we have a few questions, and
Great.
Tricia, you're unmuted as well if you want to contribute anything. This is a great question, and I would love to hear your thoughts. It's more of a general question, but what is the best tip for finding the right therapist or someone seeking treatment? And I know that, Tricia and I, having spent time with you, both wish that you were our therapist.
Oh, how nice.
And we hear that a lot of people think that, but
Well, that's very flattering. I do have to tell you one thing about my voice, though. When I had a patient come in, she goes, I've been listening to your podcast. I really like it. And I said, great. She goes, but by the way, I can't listen to it while I'm driving. And I said, why not? She goes, because it puts me to sleep.
very calming,
I didn't quite know whether that was a compliment or kind of a dig. Well, I don't know if she's talking about in general, or he talking about in general, how do you, locate a good therapist. I'll try to answer that. And then I'll also answer, people have said, but do therapists know about perfectly hidden depression? No, most do not. Now, I've had the extreme honor of hearing from people saying, yes, my therapist gave me your book, or my therapist told me to listen to your podcast, and they are fully on board with this concept. And that's really very helpful. But, I'm thinking about trying to do sort of a training manual for therapists in the near future. And that might be something that would really be very helpful. But finding a therapist in general, and this, of course, is really tough for people who identify with perfectly hidden depression, because the best way to do it is to ask your friends, what kind of experience have you had with this therapist? So you have to reveal that there's something you need help with. And that's very hard for people who are hiding depression. But I would say that that's a lot less hard than going into some therapist that you don't know, that you've never heard anything about, and they just kind of look at you, and then either the fit isn't right. I have all kinds of things on my website, which is drmargaretrutherford.com, about finding a therapist. I have a couple of podcasts on it. I want to say it's 114 is, gosh, how did I pick that out of my head? How to interview a potential therapist. So I have a lot of that practical advice, both on my podcast and on my website. And if you go to the website and use the search term finding a therapist, then that would be helpful. Maybe that's the best way I can answer that question today. Somebody's listening to my podcast. That's the music.
We have someone who asked the best therapy modalities to start working through this. And I know that you're going to be touching on that. And
yes, definitely.
Part 2 on August 13th. So we would welcome everyone to join us. Another question is how to cope with existential crisis as we keep on making things perfect as soon as we can.
Okay, so let me answer the first one first. Actually, I use a combination of therapies when I'm helping someone with perfectly hidden depression. I use a lot of just relationship skills and relationship building and emotionally focused kinds of therapies. But I also use CBT because, and we'll talk about this more next time, a lot of these people are using outdated rules and have outdated belief systems that, again, were part of that childhood survival strategy, but they just don't fit anymore. In fact, sometimes they're even doing damage. And so we look at that from a very CBT-oriented kind of thing, where you want to identify those rules, figure out, are they helpful, are they destructive, and then you replace those rules very actively. That's very much cut and dried CBT. But then the next step is to do a more of a family systems kind of approach, where you look at what's called a trauma timeline, and you look at family of origin, which means the family you grew up in, and you want to really look for those patterns. You want to look for what happened when you were 2 and 4 and 8 and 10 and 20 and 30, and how are all those things connected. And a therapist really can help with that. Let me make sure I say something. I will repeat this probably 47 times next time. But if you have severe trauma in your background, you should not do this work by yourself. You should do it with someone who's trained in trauma work. And really, and in fact, in finding a therapist, you can ask them, have you been trained in trauma work? And if they say, oh, well, I read a lot about it. No, not good. They need to be maybe an EMDR, eye movement desensitization and reprocessing therapy is really good for trauma. Again, we'll really cover that in 2 weeks. Now, the second question was something about existential something or another. How do you deal with the existential dilemmas when you're trying to heal from
With
perfectly hidden depression, I think? Yeah.
crisis as we keep on making things perfect.
Yes. Okay. That is a great question because, of course, and I use this example in the book that it's kind of like, when I was young, which was a long time ago, we had pickup sticks where, you'd have all these sticks that would be interlaced with one another and you'd have to pick the stick out to not jumble or make everything else fall apart. Now there's Jenga. And you have pieces that you're trying to pull very carefully because you don't want the structure to be destroyed. That's like the work with perfectly hidden depression, because as a therapist and as a collaborator with the patient or the client, I'm trying to find the piece. In Laura's story, for example, she said, I decided the best way to go about this was to begin working on my over responsibility. And so that's the story about sitting on our hands. In fact, one of the exercises that are the beginning exercises in the book are list the traits, the 10 core traits, and which one would be the easiest for you to begin to address. You don't start with the hardest just because you're a perfectionist, and you may want to, and that may be your ilk. You have to train yourself to work with the easiest first and experience some success with that. You want to pick out the Jenga piece that is the easiest to get before you try to, before you risk disrupting so much that literally someone does begin to fall apart. For example, in Tony's story, if I had pushed him and said, well, no, we need to do EMDR, he didn't want to do it because he didn't know if he'd do it right. That's not the right piece. He's giving me all kinds of information that's too much for him. So we started more with labeling his emotions, and that's something that he found very hard to do. And so that was a much safer place for us to start. And then he began to respond by being less perfectionistic with himself. So some of that is therapeutic judgment. But I really tried to convey that in the book, where there are over 60 exercises in the book. And there was a critical review in Goodreads, or it was one of the more critical ones. She actually had some nice things to say, but she said, I loved the first 3 chapters of the book. Then all of a sudden, it kind of became like a therapy session. And I thought, yeah, that's right. That's exactly what it's supposed to become. So you want to take these exercises and begin to do them. And if, again, they become too hard, you need to involve a friend, a very trusted friend, or a therapist to help you. So, but you there is a lot of balancing there, and you can't do. I've had very perfectionistic people said, I thought I'd come in for 6 weeks and, we'd have this, done, accomplished. And I said, no, it's going to take a little longer than 6 sessions, So it takes some patience, and it takes some wisdom about what's the best next thing to try to change.
Margaret?
Yeah.
One of the questions was, what are one of the first steps to take when stuck in a cycle? I wasn't sure what they were talking about with regard to which cycle they mean, I guess. But I did want to use that question to bring up the reflections in the packet that everybody
great.
got.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
Yeah, because when we talk about working through first steps in anything, those reflections have been specifically chosen from the book. You can want to go ahead and explain them? Okay.
I will be quite frank with you. I was on my way home, and I was going to stop by my office. For some reason, my printer isn't working here at the house, and I was going to print off the materials. And it was pouring down rain, and I said, "Okay, do I want to get absolutely really, really wet, or do I want to kind of wing it about these workshop exercises?" So I'm winging it. And what I do remember about the ones that I chose was very specifically ones that would sort of fit together, that wouldn't take you so far into where you don't need to go by yourself, certainly, but would give you an example or an experience with what doing those exercises would be like. And it was things like, look at your circle of friends and acquaintances and who actually knows you. And that would be the inner circle. Then there would be a circle that was a little wider, or I didn't do very well in geometry, so whatever that would be called. And then another circle that would be wider and bigger. And so you have, I don't know what you call that, kind of little circle. There you go, concentric circles. And you would actually put the names of the people who belong in the inner circle, if there's anybody. is there anybody in that inner circle? And then who's in the next circle? You have to be really honest with yourself, because sometimes, again, that can really engender loneliness. You realize, gosh, there are not very many people I've allowed to let know me. So, and the whole point is we want to build that circle slowly, very slowly. And so there are things like that that I thought would be thought provoking and would lead to an experience of, oh, this is where she's going with this. But they're also exercises that hopefully, again, we don't want you to go down that hole we talked about. We want you to steer clear of it. So, there are also exercises that are a little easier to do on your own. But I do, maybe try to do them between now and next time, and I'll answer any of your questions about it.
Okay, great. Oh, we do have just a commentary here, but maybe you can speak to it, the compartmentalization.
Yes.
It says, I built a file cabinet since childhood and didn't expect the session would touch on so many aspects of her life, and reminded her that a lot of things have been filed away, and that she tends to plow forward too much. PTSD can lead to dissociative behavior as well. So
Right.
can you speak to that a little more?
Yes. I have a section of the book that actually I'd love to rewrite. um, because I talked about levels of awareness, and some people were very aware, probably those high functioning depression people, that they were very aware that they were putting things in their file cabinet, like perhaps this listener was doing. And there are people who that has been such a habit that it's actually an unconscious procedure. It's kind of like when we all learned how to drive your car. You had to think about everything you had to do, and then all of a sudden all that went underground, and you just get in your car and somehow you land where you're supposed to go. And you don't think about the operation of driving anymore. So, this habit of compartmentalization can be very much like that. You can learn so effectively, and it becomes so unconscious that you do it without even thinking about it. And that we have to try to undo again very, very carefully, because certainly with one memory, I do use this metaphor analogy in the book. But when you're trying to clean out your closet, and so you pull something out. Maybe y'all are all neat freaks. I am not. And so I pull something out of my closet, and like 14 other things come with it and fall on the floor. So, and here you've got this stuff on the floor that you didn't even know was in the closet. Well, we don't want that to happen. We have to pretty carefully orchestrate what comes out of that closet. And then, but what you also see is that something was actually behind it. So, you can begin this search and then realize there are other things that you didn't want to think about or rigidly compartmentalize. So, I would say to this listener that, I hope it was a healing experience or a positive experience for you to realize just how unconscious that has become. And the wonderful thing is that you can, I said a few minutes ago that the glass is half full and half empty by definition. I certainly believe and would recommend that most of us try to live our life in the half full side, that looking on the positive side of life is a wonderful gift to give yourself and other people. But again, by definition, it's half empty. So knowing how to safely connect with pain, with hurt, with confusion, with fear, with anger, with sadness, with, anything is such an important skill. And you feel healthier as a person. You feel more competent as a person because you don't have to be scared of feeling those things. You can feel them, connect with them, and then get back into the side of the glass that's half full and live your life there, being very aware that there is kind of think of a swimming pool, and you love to be around on the shallow end, and that's great, but you're aware there's a deep end. But if you fall into the deep end, you know how to swim out of it.
Margaret, there was a question about someone having an older family member who says, I don't like to talk about my problems and I don't need therapy. How could they encourage them to, attend a therapy session if they don't feel like they need it or want to acknowledge that they do.
Well, frankly, that is something that happens a lot. Older generations. Now, it's interesting. I'm 65, and when I was in my 20s, I went to therapy. And none of my family ever went to therapy, and I don't remember them ever really saying anything. But maybe just they thought I was so screwed up, I needed to go to therapy, so they didn't have a problem with it. But I know a lot of people in my generation and older do not believe in that, and it's ignorance about what therapy is. That's one of the reasons why I started the Self Work podcast, because I wanted to give people a chance to hear what a therapist sounds like, and what they might hear from a therapist. And I love it when people write me, and they've left me several reviews saying, I was one of those people that would never darken the door of a therapist, and listening to you has made me realize that it would be helpful, and I have started therapy. So with this family member, one of the things you can do is to get into therapy yourself so that you can handle watching someone that could have a happier life and yet or a more fulfilled life, and they're choosing not to do that. They cannot risk. Here's an important thing to consider. A lot of the times people are not keeping something away from us. I mean, if this parent said, I wish I could bring myself to do that, but I simply can't. Or maybe they just say that's stupid and I'm not going to do it. It may not be that they are withholding that. They aren't capable of doing that. And my mother had terrible OCD. She never received any kind of therapy for it. She unfortunately was prescribed multiple anxiety medications and became a prescription drug addict. And I've often thought if she had just gone into therapy, but her generation and just her personality was not, she would never do that. So it was very sad to watch her actually destroy her life. The last 15 years of her life, um, she was practically mute. So it was very, very sad. And so you have to deal with your own sadness and your own sense of this person that I love, I cannot help. The other thing you can do is to say, okay, mom, well, you know, I listen to this podcast. You won't go to therapy, but you listen to that. And I'm not the only, I mean, there are plenty of mental health podcasts. So mine is just one of them. But you can say, well, let me put this on while I'm in the kitchen making your sandwich and just see, if you can plant a seed. Sometimes you can plant a seed, but sometimes your loved one is not capable and you have to deal with that and just allow yourself to grieve.
There's another question, Margaret. How can someone who struggles with vulnerability open up to a therapist?
Slowly. In fact, I'm not being cute. I mean, I've had plenty of people. I will never forget one of the people that actually, I talk about her at the very beginning of the book. And she walked in, young woman, just very, very attractive young woman, could have been a model. And she looked at me and she said, I heard you on Periscope. At the time I was trying to do Periscope. It was an utter failure, except for attracting her. And she said, I've heard you on Periscope. And I know I have this perfectly hidden depression, but I want to tell you something. I'm not going to talk about it for a long time. And I said, okay. And I said, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about. And she said, it's got to be on my own terms. I said, that's fine. You're in charge. I'm not in charge of what we talk about. You're in charge. And so I think that you can walk into a therapist office and say to them, the only thing you have to say, maybe, or choose to say, is this: I'm not the person that I pretend to be. I'm not the person that you may even think I am. I have things that I've never told anyone, and I'm not sure I can tell you about them. And so the conversation becomes about the fear of the vulnerability, not the thing you're scared of sharing. The conversation becomes about your fear of vulnerability. And that can actually, you can never talk about the content and only talk about the process. So that's a really great way to start. And I've had many such conversations like that, where we only talk about what the process would be like. Because they have to learn how to trust me. I've got a book and I've got a podcast, but what's it really going to be like to work with me? So I let them take their time and I push a little, but I always tell people especially if there's trauma in their life, you're in charge of how fast we go and what we talk about, not me. And if I go too fast, tell me I'm going too fast.
The other thing I wanted to just chime in real quick and mention that I found beautiful in reading the book and having just spent time with you, Margaret, is and throughout your podcast too, you share your vulnerability and your imperfections and your struggles, and I think that's so meaningful and makes us realize everybody is human. And I know that you've
Right.
spoken with you've spoken about having an eating disorder when
Hmm.
you were younger and having social anxiety. And I feel like, I know when I was reading it, I felt just so connected, even more connected, because it touches you and it's moving. And I feel like it gives everyone else permission in a way to
Right.
be imperfect.
Oh yeah, I've had panic disorder since I was 26 or 27 years old, and I was a performer at the time. I was a professional musician, and believe me, performance anxiety was not a good thing to have back then. I still have a little bit of it. This was a new format for me, and so I have a little medication. It's not a benzodiazepine. I steer way clear of those because of my mother's history. But about 4 o'clock this afternoon, I took what's called a beta blocker just to kind of calm my body down. My body was sending me these signals of, oh, you're about to get anxious. You're about to get anxious. So, I've learned that that is my friend at times. Now, once I do 3 or 4 of these, I won't take it anymore. But, um, you know, I sometimes have to get something under my belt before I am okay with it. My anorexia, my food behavior is gone, but I cannot look at a picture of myself without going, ooh, does that roll show? And it sure would look better if I were 10 pounds lighter. I still have that thinking. I probably will always have that thinking. But now I go, be quiet. You're just fine. You know, you're fine. Get over yourself and don't listen to that voice of shame that's in your ear. It's not helpful. It's just not helpful. So, I work with that. I also had 2 divorces in my 20s, and actually one was in my early 30s and one was in my 20s. So I had a lot of shame about that and thought I would never talk to anybody about that. But there was a woman sitting in front of me one day, and I had moved to Fayetteville, Arkansas, and I was there, and she said, "I'm going to get my second divorce." And then she looked up and she said, "But I know you would never know. You wouldn't know what that was like." And I had not told a soul. And all I said to her was, well, you're about to join a club that I've been a member of for a long time. And tears came to her eyes, and I kind of got a little emotional. I didn't talk any more about it. That's my life, but I wanted to let her know, yes, I did understand. And so as a therapist, it used to be in old school training for therapy that you were just completely anonymous to your patients. You didn't have any pictures of your family anywhere in your office, and you certainly didn't start a blog where you talked about crying in the car after your son was gone to college. That was just a big no-no. And there obviously has been a much greater movement toward transparency. Therapists have all kinds of podcasts and are on Instagram, and as I am. And so, there's a lot more transparency. You still have to be very careful that what you say about yourself is something that's not helpful for you to say, but is actually useful for your patient. And if you're sitting over there talking about, yourself because you're enjoying the sound of your own voice, then there's something really bad wrong, and the person needs to get another therapist. But thank you for that, Cindy. When I went on social media in 2012, I made the decision to be very transparent, and I've continued to be even more and more so. So,
No, it's wonderful. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time and just again thank you from the bottom of our hearts, from
oh
Tricia,
gosh,
Joy, and I, and everyone who attended. Thank you so much for joining us. And Tricia, do you have? I wanted to just share as far as part 2 goes. We will be using the same link. I will send that. I will be
okay.
posting that on Eventbrite with part 2. So I would welcome and encourage everyone to join us
I
for
hope you will.
the healing part, right, of perfectly hidden
Yeah.
depression.
Yeah.
And
Let's talk about getting better.
I just want to say we're honoring Tricia's friend Patricia tonight. And I'm hoping that this turns into, an incredible community. And I was talking to another friend before this workshop about, even after part 2, perhaps we can do some other breakout sessions where it's even more intimate, because you can do that now with Zoom too, which is really cool, where you can have smaller groups and actually engage. And I'd love for everybody to participate and share their voices, but Tricia and I had to sort of, ask the questions to sort of manage it, because there were so many people. So, which is a wonderful thing. So Tricia, any parting words? And then
no, I would just encourage people to get the packet or the workbook that we put together for tonight, and try getting started on the reflections. Even if you don't feel that you identify with perfectly hidden depression, the reflections from the book that are in, some of which are in the packet, are so helpful for so many different reasons. Really like
that's at drmargaretrutherford.com/workshop.
Yeah, I put it in the chat section as well. And again, even there's some exercises in the book too that I've started diving into, and they're very, very helpful. And they can be difficult too. So
yes, they're not easy.
Yeah.
I just want to say that the just one specifically that I think was really, really helpful will be in part 2, not to tease everybody, but the trauma timeline, Dr. Margaret, is powerful.
You have to be careful with that. So we'll talk about it next time, because it's got some complications and complexities that other things don't have, but it's certainly it can be very helpful. Sure.
Yeah, I just want to say how powerful they are. So if people want to get started just looking at them or filling them out.
Yeah. Thank you again to everybody that's here. Thank you to Cindy and Tricia and Joy. Y'all talk about being honored. I am incredibly honored, and I also have thought about Patricia during this entire time. So
thank you for sharing your gift, Margaret. And
sure.
Yeah. Tricia, thank you for birthing this for us. So
sure.
Oh, thanks.
Love you both, and Joy too. I think she had to pop off, but anyway, thank you all for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you on August 13th at 7:00. Have a wonderful evening.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.